Minister, in recent times, how often have we heard the phrase, "Don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good"? And in many ways, I think this applies to the legislation we're discussing today. Now, much of what's in this legislation is good, and in that context, I commend you, Minister, for bringing forward the legislation. I listened carefully to your contribution yesterday, and one of the things I appreciated was the fact that you gave credit to many others who had worked on this legislation before you, and you named them. Your own contribution indicates your determination to ensure that the legislation we end up with is fit for purpose. So, Minister, that much I welcome. However, this bill that I would call good is good in the context of the current totally unsatisfactory situation. But, Minister, I still believe that amendments are needed to improve this legislation so that a good bill can become a better one, even if not a perfect one. Now, I hope that because you gave credit to others for their work on this legislation up to now, that you will show the same flexibility in coming weeks when it comes to taking on board at least some of the more important recommendations from the Joint Committee on the Birth Information and Tracing Bill, the bill we're discussing. The work of this committee and all who made submissions to it is hugely valuable in that it adds to the legislation and refines it in such a way as to make it fully fit for purpose. I know there are 83 recommendations in the report. I've gone through it, and I know you've taken some of them on board, but many others you have not. And I'm asking that you would take those into consideration at committee stage. Now, some of the most important outstanding recommendations include the removal of the mandatory information session requirement. And it's really important, Minister, to say that the committee makes a positive, or puts in place a positive and reasonable alternative to that requirement. So, in cases where a mandatory information session is required, on page 34 of the report, and I quote, it says, "The mandatory information session should be removed from the legislation. An alternative, appropriate safeguard should instead be provided for, such as sending of correspondence by registered post." Minister, I think this would vindicate the right to privacy just as well as any mandatory information session. A letter clearly setting out the situation and the circumstances would be just as legally sound as an individual delivering the same information. You could, for example, include a possibility for an adopted person to request further information where they thought necessary. The right to identity trumps the right to privacy, but we know and agree that consideration must also be given to the right to privacy. And I believe that consideration and that right can be vindicated and does not require attendance at a mandatory information session. Other colleagues have said it, and I hate to repeat it, but I think it's true, because I think it shows a paternalistic approach, a lecture from somebody perhaps employed by TUSLA or some other person, rather than information provision. In other words, listen to me and what I'm saying, rather than these are the circumstances that we want you to take into consideration. And you know, if you give a letter to somebody or a short document, they're much more likely to read it carefully and pay attention. You know, you hardly remember half of what people say to you. So if you really want to vindicate the right, I honestly think that a written document will be more powerful and perhaps more legally sound than what an individual might or might not say at an information session. And the truth is, Minister, whether you like it or not, many people do feel demeaned by that requirement. And basically they feel they're being told, sit down and listen to what I have to say. And Minister, I think you must find an alternative. And I believe and hope you will. Now, I have read through the committee report. I'm not on the committee, and I don't pretend to be an expert. I've read what Clon have said, and they've some excellent analysis of this situation and the legislation. And I've received emails from many constituents and indeed from people throughout the country. And I have only time to raise some of the more important issues. Actually, I have a little bit more time than I thought I'd have. But anyway, the issue of the false registration of births, I think, has to be recognised in this legislation. There's a huge difference, indeed, a criminal offence difference, if that's a proper phrase, between deliberately falsified and incorrectly recorded details on birth certificates. Illegal and unlawful adoptions must be fully recognised and acknowledged. And I see you're taking some notes, Minister, and I hope that what you say to me will make me feel better about that particular situation. As I said, I'm not an expert when it comes to this, but I have gone through the report. You're in charge of this legislation, Minister. That's great responsibility. And it is difficult for you. It's actually very difficult to right all the historical wrongs. But now is the time, Minister, because many will not live to see another piece of legislation vindicating their rights. So I would say to you that changes must be made to ensure that this bill allows the following: unconditional access to birth certificates and birth information for everyone, a clear statutory right to access one's own care or adoption file. And as many colleagues have quoted what Clon have said, the file, the whole file, and nothing but the file. There can be no discrimination when accessing personal data, and there has to be a strong presumption towards openness. Also, there must be a statutory right of access to the administrative records. It doesn't matter who holds that information, whether they're adoption agencies, institutions, state bodies, or others. We all recognise that this legislation must be robust. One or two colleagues have spoken at the fact that it may well be tested in the courts, and we understand all of that. But the legislation, while it must be robust, has also to be fit for purpose. And, in this case, the purpose of this legislation is once and for all to deal with many historical wrongs imposed on so many adoptees who've had no access to their information. And I agree with Deputy Pringle and what he says. As we stand here, and I know you feel this the same as the rest of us, we must fully understand who this legislation affects. Now, that can't take away from its robustness, but I honestly believe, Minister, that some of the more difficult aspects, and there's only a few sticking points, there really at the end of the day are only a few. I believe the Joint Committee offers you alternatives and possible solutions to ensure that the legislation remains robust, but equally that it takes into consideration the impact that this legislation has on the many people throughout the country who are so eagerly awaiting it. So, Minister, I've said it about 10 times, but I'll say it once more. Please look again at this report. I know you've probably read it many times, but look at it again and use the flexibility that you have and that I believe committee stage will help to provide to ensure that, as I said at the beginning, while this legislation may not be perfect, that it will be better than it is right now. Thank you.